Good evening. Hello and welcome. I am Beth Finch, the Colby Museum's Chief Curator, and it is a pleasure and an honor to facilitate tonight's Art and program dedicated to the topic of learning to look, photography in practice. Before we get fully underway, I want to note that if you would like to use the captions feature, you will find it at the bottom of your screen. It's the live transcript tab. Also, this program is being recorded and will be available with captioning in about a week on our website and YouTube channel. Art and is an event series that brings together invited guests for conversations about exhibitions, collections, and projects at the Colby College Museum of Art and its Lunder Institute for American Art. Tonight's conversation, which has been organized in conjunction with the exhibition Act of Sight, the Tsiaras Family Photography Collection, is inspired by a key subset of photographers featured in the exhibition who also make or have made contributions as teachers of photography. So, in addition to active photography practices, whether in the studio, the street, or elsewhere, they have also served as photography instructors in various contexts. Collectively, they shape how photography is taught and therefore passed down and transformed generation to generation. Two of our guests tonight, Roz Gerstein and Gary Green, are represented in the Tsiaras Collection. They each have a photo on view in the associated exhibition, and they belong to the category of teacher photographers. It's an illustrious group, as you shall see and hear from them tonight. And in their accompanying images, they will also offer reflections on their own artistic trajectories. In addition, we are joined by Anthony Lee, the Idella Plimpton Kendall Professor of Art History at Mount Holyoke. Dr. Lee contributed a terrific essay on the photographer William Christenberry to the Act of Sight catalog, which is one of the reasons he came to mind when we were envisioning this program. Another reason is that in addition to writing about photography, Tony is himself a photographer. And in this context, we appreciated the hands-on perspective he brings to the subject of how photography is taught, learned, and interpreted through words and images. Tonight, as a prelude to Roz and Gary's presentations, Tony will speak about a few early examples of photography instruction in the US context. Additional biographical information on our guests is provided in the chat and is also available on the Colby Museum's events page. After these presentations, I will lead us in a conversation that will segue to time for questions from our other revered guests of this program, namely all of you tuning in webinar mode. As you listen tonight, you are welcome and in fact encouraged to add questions to the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Finally, I want to complete my opening remarks with two acknowledgements, both of which relate to place. The first is local. It relates to here, the Colby Museum. The Colby Museum is situated in the homeland of the Wabanaki people. We express our respect to the Indigenous communities who have lived on these ancestral lands for generations and the future generations. The other acknowledgement is national and global, but it is also, in some sense, local. It relates to here. The Tsiaras Family Photography Collection is primarily composed of American photographs, and the 20th century is particularly well represented. Therefore, the reverberations of World War II run throughout the galleries that comprise the exhibition Act of Sight. Some of the photographers who sought shelter in the US before, during, and after that conflict went on to be teachers. I am thinking and have been thinking in recent days about the photographer, Hungarian-born photographer György Kepes, who taught at the new Bauhaus, which became the Institute of Design, and we'll hear about that place a bit tonight. But by acknowledging these forebears during a time of renewed war in Ukraine, we can take inspiration from the contributions these photographers made to documenting their life experiences. One reason to learn to look and to look again is to remember, reflect, and define ways forward. At this difficult time, as we all seek ways to understand what is happening better, there are ample opportunities for this process of reflection and taking stock in the exhibition active site. With that, I will turn things over to Tony Lee. Thank you all for being here this evening.
Thank you, Beth. Could I just, before I begin my talk, thank Beth and Chris Bergstrom for inviting me to speak this evening with you, and also Alex, who is off screen, who is the magician of Zoom here. And also, if I could thank all of you who are in the audience who have come and spent part of your dinner hour with us. Okay. So my charge tonight is to speak about teaching of photography in the first half of the 20th century. And I've identified three key practitioners and practices and schools where we might be able to identify something of a history of the teaching of photography in this country. But if you don't mind, I will begin in the previous century for just a few minutes to talk about how one learned photography prior to that moment. So if you were a young photographer in the 19th century, there were many avenues that you could learn how to use a camera and what to use it for. There were the usual informal kinds of passages, friend to friend, father to son or daughter, neighbor to neighbor, studio mate to studio mate, and the ways in which you could learn the practice. But there was also a very rich literature about how to learn photography. And on the left image here, I'm showing you just one of many, many examples of publications that were produced in the 19th century. You could read through or subscribe to the various journals, and oftentimes these journals were filled with detailed, sometimes quite plodding directions about how you could work the camera. But if you couldn't read, for example, or you didn't have enough money to subscribe to a journal, there was always the traveling salesman who was peddling photography equipment and photography supplies, who would have been happy to teach you and show you how to use those supplies for your practice. Towards the end of the 19th century, beginning primarily in the 1890s, there was yet another venue where you could learn how to use the camera. And that was through the local camera club, which began to be developed around 1890 or so. And they were rich and varied clubs, and they were part of the great age of clubbing. You know, we sometimes don't have these today, but in the 1890s, you know, you could join bowling clubs and knitting clubs and sewing clubs and athletic clubs. And of course, you could join camera clubs. And it was in these informal spaces where frequently club members would pool their resources to buy darkroom equipment, especially the all-important enlarger, and also had various kinds of speakers come through the club, where you could actually learn in a more sustained way the photographic practice. And in particular, for many of these photographers, these clubs often had exhibitions, as we see over on the right in Newark, Ohio, where by virtue of inclusion or exclusion from the exhibitions, you could learn something about what good photography was about, or at least what acceptable photography was about. So let me turn to the 20th century now, and I'll segue to that by suggesting that it was in these clubs where really the first school of photography kind of took its shape. And it begins with my first nomination for a key figure would be this figure, Clarence White, who, born in Ohio, like many of his contemporaries, learned photography in the local Newark Camera Club. And there was something about the experience of the club that when he came east to settle on the East Coast, primarily in New York, that he took with him, something about the quality of instruction in the club, the conviviality of the club, the sociality of the club, the kind of, and in truth, the kind of class-based nature of the club, rather made up of kind of well-heeled amateurs frequently, or the middle classes, that really informed the way in which he thought about photography. It was in 1907 in New York where he was hired to be a part-time teacher at what was called the Columbia Teachers College. associated today, once again, with Columbia University. But at the time, I guess we would have called it something of a night school. And he was a part-time teacher at this night school, where he began to develop some ideas about teaching photography and developed a kind of pedagogical program. But as I say, developing out of his experiences in the Newark Camera Club. It was in 1910 where he actually left New York and during the summers moved up to a portion of the coast not very far from Colby College itself in Georgetown Island, Maine, where he established a summer school for classes using, as we see over on the right, his Primo View camera, his preferred camera of choice, as his basis for teaching those classes here. And it was made up of those kinds of middle-class audiences that once made at the club that came to summers and to summer and vacation on the coast of Maine to join his club, to join his school. We're very lucky because we have a number of observations, some recall and retrospectives of what his teaching was like. And so if you don't mind, I'm going to read a somewhat long passage by one of his students explaining and describing what a session or a summer session was like with Clarence White on the coast of Maine. So I'll begin. You will have to report at the classes every morning at 9 o'clock. And seated on rustic chairs, you will hear criticism on the work of the class by Mr. White, for he lectures on each picture. It is here that one's secret hope is realized or disappointed. The morning lecture ceases at 10, and with camera and kit, you are soon bounding over hill and shore in quest of pictorial material. Old houses with long chimneys and typical natives await you. The afternoon is generally devoted to enlargements and studio work. And to the curriculum have been added lectures illustrated by lantern slides of the work of successful painters and photographers. Perhaps one of the most interesting and exciting features is the, quote, 4 o'clock problem. A member is requested to choose a landscape or figure to be photographed at that hour. Every member must then express himself independently, and the results are lectured upon next morning at the 9 o'clock session. It's kind of a wonderful recounting of what these days were like. In 1914, Clarence White opened a school in New York, and he named it, quite simply, the Clarence White School of Photography. But it was the experience of the summer schools in Maine that he brought that same pedagogy to New York City. The schools were held in residences, invariably his residences. And so it retained something of a kind of informal, domestic, convivial quality that the residences provided. If I were to summarize White's philosophy of photography and its significance for our program tonight, I'd put it this way. White believed that cultivating good taste was one of the fundamental bases for becoming a good person. And in turn, being a good person was the fundamental requirement for being a good citizen. Developing good taste in photography was a matter of seeing, or indeed proposing, that there was a poetic aspect in everyday life, and that the domestic world was full of small wonders. For White, poetry in photography meant soft focus, heavy reworking of the image through platinum and gum printing, and very often Japanese-inspired ideas about design, spare, asymmetrical, delicately balanced. The results were prints that he and his contemporaries called pictorialist, the name itself emphasizing that these were not documents or the haphazard stuff that the common Kodak developers spit out, but carefully arranged pictures, full of feeling, a commitment to beauty, and most of all, good taste. So my second nomination for a key moment and set of figures of teachers in the early 20th century would be these photographers associated in the 1930s with an organization called the Photo League, also in New York City, begun in 1936, lasting for about 15 years until 1951 when it closed its doors. Quite unlike Clarence White's main school, or indeed his residence schools in New York City, the Photo League was organized around Union Square. And as its name implies for us, and for those of us who have traveled down there know very well, a hustling, bustling place. At the time, the neighborhood of the working classes, and as its name tells us, of unions, labor unions and labor union headquarters. It was a league, a club made up of the working classes and frequently immigrants or the children of immigrants. As we see over here on the left, Sid Grossman, a child of immigrants from Eastern Europe, and over on the right, Lisette Modell, an immigrant herself. In the 1930s, when the League was founded, the club members were very much shaped by the experience of the Great Depression, and it's mostly working class and largely immigrant members. It was a far more collaborative school than White's, and it was far less expensive than White's was. It also, very importantly, developed a curriculum of photography. And this will sound very familiar to those folks who have taken photography classes today or have been enrolled in studio programs. Sid Grossman on the left was the kind of architect of the curriculum at the Photo League. And he organized his curriculum into a tiered system. The first year you took basic photography, right? The second year you took advanced photography. And the third year you took something he called the documentary workshop. For him, it was in the belief that the first two courses were efforts to teach the handling of the camera so that using it became so instinctive that his students were prepared for street work and the most important of the classes, the workshop, the documentary workshop. And as we can tell, in comparison or perhaps in contrast to Clarence White's camera, these were photographers who relied on the small portable camera. As we see in their hands here, Modell's and Grossman's hands, the twin lens reflex camera, or frequently also the rangefinder, which was also a quite small portable camera. To give you some sense of the ethos of this school and why the documentary workshop, that final class, was the most important of the teachings of photography, let me read to you the Photo League's credo. And as I read this to you, you might keep in mind Clarence White's credo and Clarence White's practice of photography up in Maine and in his residences. So if I'm going to quote here, quote, "Photography has a tremendous social value. Upon the photographer rests the responsibility and duty of recording a true image of the world as it is today during the Great Depression. Photography has long suffered from the stultifying influence of pictorialism. The Photo League's task is to put the camera back in the hands of honest photographers who will use it to photograph America." These photographers did not have fancy printing rooms or dark rooms. They had a single dark room. They relied on the 35mm film, widely available. They relied on widely available and relatively expensive silver gelatin paper to develop their prints. The documentary workshop was organized such that students worked in groups. And in fact, in these groups, they never referred to themselves as photographers, but as workers, very self-consciously as workers. And they became groups that planned their sessions together in a collaborative fashion. They moved through the streets together and afterwards debriefed together about their experiences and critiqued the images they made. So if I were to summarize the Photo League's significance and its ideas about teaching photography, I would put it this way. A collaborative venture, the Photo League believed that the teaching of photography and the use of the camera were inseparable from bearing witness to the daily lives of ordinary citizens in the throes of economic and social calamity. To bear witness meant providing proof or evidence that something exists or is the case. The unspoken assumption that such existence was normally ignored or set aside. It meant going out into the streets, developing skills with a handheld camera, and meditating on the relationship between the photographers and the subjects of their gaze, of the communities and peoples from which, in truth, so many of them came. They captured the great pleasures on the streets and also, importantly, its gross injustices. Armed with portable cameras, long lists of readings, and ideas grown out of heavy discussion, as much social and political as aesthetic, that the Photo League students learned that photography was an activist education. So let me turn finally to my third nomination for a key figure and moment of the teaching of photography, and that is with the great photographer Ansel Adams, perhaps the most important photographer in the early part of the 20th century who established photography as a fine art. We often think of his photographs themselves as establishing photography as a fine art, but Adams was remarkable because he was institutionally significant as well. He helped found the Department of Photography in the Museum of Modern Art. He helped found something what was called still today the Center for Creative Photography in Arizona, one of the great archives of photography in this country. He established the importance of photographs for the environmentalist movement and the National Park Service, and he was a profoundly influential teacher. If you asked Adams early in his life if he would be teaching photography, he would have probably said, by no means, no. But it was about the 1930s and 1940s that he began to do very, very informal workshops of photography, gaining fame as a helpful teacher and a thoughtful practitioner who had a very deliberate method and technique about the photographic practice that he dispersed to his students. It was in 1945 that the California School of Fine Arts, which is today known as the San Francisco Art Institute, hired Adams to open its first department of photography in its fine arts school. And he was part of a plethora of hirings in the 1940s by the California School of Fine Arts that transformed the curriculum of that school. I'm going to list a number of names of painters who were hired at the same time as Adams was hired to give you some sense of the flavor. And then some of these names might be familiar to you. Clifford Still, Hassel Smith, Elmer Bischoff, David Park, Richard Diebencourt, eventually Mark Rothko, Ad Reinhardt. And so for Adams, and for the significance of the teaching of photography in the first part of the 20th century, it was the first department of photography that was actually offered in a fine arts institution. Students there were asked to, and indeed encouraged to take not only photographic classes, but painting classes, drawing classes, sculptural classes, and in 1947, even film classes. And so photography was part of a rich curriculum of fine arts thinking. But it was also a moment in time when each of those disciplines made it incumbent upon students to distinguish between the disciplines, to understand their overlaps and crossovers, but also what made photographic practice in particular unique among the disciplines. For Adams, this was something that led to what became known as pure photography, a photography that was like a medium like no other. Among other things, this meant exploring the full tonal image that a camera could provide and developing a technical procedure that enabled that exploration. By one standard for Adams and his students, the richness and success of a print could be measured by the majestic tonal range it exhibited. Adams developed a particular system, which today is still known as the zone system, the gold standard of photographic technique, which still exists and is still frequently taught today. As Adams famously said in one of his often repeated phrases, expose for the shadows, develop for the highlights. So quickly, as I can finish up here, if I were to summarize Adams's ideas about photography and how that made its way into the classroom, I'd put it this way. In an age when the 35mm camera and roll film were becoming ubiquitous, and state-of-the-art imports like Canon and Nikon from Japan and Leica and Zeiss Icon from Germany were regarded as drool-worthy equipment, Adams pursued an opposite path in his embrace of the old-fashioned view camera. Rather than regard the large view camera and all of its cumbersome requirements as aspects to overcome, Adams made it something to emphasize and champion. It suited his sensibility and purposes. It also meant taking advantage of and teaching all of its benefits. The deliberation required to set up a shot, which enabled him to pre-visualize, as he called it, how the image would look as a print. Using his light meter purposefully in order to gauge the subtlest nuances in the shadows and to control the tonal range of the scene before him. Using the smallest aperture of his camera's lens and leaving it open longer to allow the sharpest details to be impressed on the negative. He chose subjects that lent themselves to his procedure, landscapes and still lifes, rather than domestic scenes of White or the street scenes of the Photo League. Or perhaps the opposite is also the case. He was, from his childhood, totally enamored of the natural landscape and found a photographic method to try to capture it. A successful print by Adams and his students and the curriculum he proposed was one that brought together technical, aesthetic, and observational exactitudes. Okay, thank you. I should turn this back over to Beth.
Thank you, Tony. And we can segue to Roz's presentation now.
Thank you, Beth. I'm going to be talking about Harry Callahan and how he found his unique vision and his place as an artist, and how he helped others, including me, to discover their own path, and how he influenced my teaching. Harry was the master of observation and self-expression. This portrait of Eleanor, Harry's wife and frequent subject, really showed me the transformative power of a great portrait. Harry wasn't inclined to theorize about photography or his work, and in a video interview in 1972, he says plainly, "I want to express my life fully." And he paused and said, "Whatever that is." Here's a different kind of portrait of Eleanor, this time using multiple in-camera exposures on the same piece of film. It required endless experimentation. Harry is also known for his urban streetscapes taken during his daily photo walks. Here's another multiple exposure of windows on a building facade. Harry started out as a hobbyist photographer. The turning point came in 1941 when he attended a workshop with Ansel Adams. Harry said that when Adams showed his images, he realized the ultimate unlimited possibilities of photography, not just documenting reality, but creating forceful graphic compositions. Harry became fully committed to his art, and by 1946, he was included in the show New Photographers at the Museum of Modern Art, and he was hired to teach at Chicago's Institute of Design, often referred to as the new Bauhaus. Harry had been making non-traditional photographs that meshed well with Bauhaus ideas. In 1961, RISD hired him to teach photography to graphic design students. The next year, he started the MFA photography program. Harry gave artists a place to refine their voice, but he also wanted to give them credentials to teach. He told me that it was one of the few livings for artists like himself that allowed time to create. He also told me that teaching is a way to build an audience, and advised that an artist requires a following in order to get shown. Harry's photography program was unusually effective at turning out successful artists and teachers, including Emmett Gowen at Princeton, Linda Connor at the San Francisco Art Institute, Henry Hornstein at RISD, Lauren Shaw at Emerson, Bill Burke at the Boston Museum School, and just so many more. Harry found an interesting way to gain exposure for his students. He would include one of his prints along with curated student work in the yearly department portfolio shown here. The department sold these portfolios to raise money for our field trips, and it introduced up-and-coming talent to museums and galleries and collectors. A student of Harry's once said, Harry didn't teach photography. He taught how to be a photographer. Here are a couple of photos of Emmett Gowen, another of Harry's students, who frequently photographed his wife and extended family. You can note in the photographs in the Tsiaras collection by Callahan, Siskin, Gowen, and myself, that we all have a strong sense of design. And by that, I mean the subjects we find dictate the composition. Now I'd like to talk about how Harry taught photography. In 1967, as an undergraduate majoring in graphic design, I was required to take Harry's class. On the first day, he didn't start out with a lecture about the history of photography. Instead, we just got to work. Harry told us to go into the darkroom with his grad student assistant to make photograms. These are silver prints made without a camera. You place objects on the photo paper to block and filter light from the enlarger or your pin light flashlight. It was elemental, creating graphic shapes and tones with light, very Bauhaus in the tradition of Moholy-Nagy or Man Ray before him. After that, we went on to large format 4x5 cameras and contact prints. We were taught the basics: select a form and light it, expose negatives, process film, print, and then evaluate our prints. It was no different than how Harry and Aaron Siskin worked. Here are some examples. We crumpled paper, and with lights, we created crests and valleys, highlights and shadows. With a macro lens, we recorded intricate details enhanced by contrast and texture. With a camera bellows, we corrected parallax when photographing architecture. By the second semester, we graduated to the small format 35mm cameras, which felt like an extension of my hand. Here's one of my nude studies from that period, which Harry selected to be in the Students of Harry Callahan exhibit at the Hallmark Gallery in New York. I had been drawing a magnificent beech tree on the RISD campus for many years, and I invited Charlie, the model from our drawing class, to collaborate with me. And I think Harry liked this print because it wasn't a typical nude presentation. Rather than suggest a nude was the alluring romantic figure, I approached the model as a natural element in my own landscape. By junior year, I started doing independent study. Harry never gave much guidance, but he certainly inspired students by his example. We would see him in the neighborhood on daily morning photo walks with his camera. At our crit sessions, he would never actually criticize, but sometimes he would encourage students saying, "I think you're onto something, keep going." When I entered the MAT program at RISD, Harry invited me to join his graduate seminar. It gathered every other Sunday at Harry's home, and one evening I brought this image of Shirla to the crit session, and one student dismissed my print with barely a glance, saying, "Just couldn't relate to pictures of children." Later that evening, Harry asked to speak with me in his study. He apologized for the student's attitude, then gave me the most direct advice I'd ever heard from him. He said that to make an interesting image, all I had to do was photograph what I cared about. And that's just what I've done ever since. I think of the photographic frame as a stage in which to set my stories. Relationships are the primary source of my material. I'm not a formalist. I would rather refer to my images as snapshots in the sense that they are so spontaneous rather than studious. Like many of Harry's students, I was inspired to teach. For my senior thesis project, I developed a course of 10 photography lessons for children. I wanted to put the power of storytelling in the hands of those who were disempowered because of their youth or economic status. So I wrote to Polaroid Corporation. I got them to provide all the cameras at Instant Film, and a pastor in the neighborhood church provided a classroom for my first group of 8 boys. After the first few lessons and field trips, I sent the students home with their cameras to document how they felt about their families, friends, and neighborhood. Harry used to say that photography was the democratic art because the tools to create were accessible to anyone. Instant photography removed more barriers, and you could see the results in a couple of minutes, and if necessary, correct your mistakes. At the beginning, what made an acceptable image was simple. Don't cut off a person's head. Get the object in focus. Don't pull the print from the camera too quickly. But soon my students began to bring back truly compelling images like this one of their families and communities. Over the next year and a half, I taught 150 children. At the SPE conference in Providence a couple of years ago, I gave a talk about my classes and the book I'm developing. For fun, I included the following slides in my presentation to compare my students' images with similar ones I found by well-known photographers. See if you can tell which of these is by the child photographer. I think you'll be surprised. For photographers at any age or level, there appears to be a simple recipe for success, summarized here. Harry Callahan always followed this approach, with the most important thing being photograph what you care about. Thank you. Back to you, Beth.
Thank you so much, Roz. Gary, please take it away.
Okay, thanks, Beth. I'll start by thanking Tony and Roz for their presentations, which then made me make notes and feel like I had to kind of chime in on some of the things they said, because it reminded me of some points that I'd like to make. So I wanted to say first, thanks to the museum for inviting me to do this. And I wanted to say that I don't know if that's your subtitle, Tony, or the museum's Learning to Look, Photography in Practice. But I think you can kind of flip it very easily and say you can't see if you don't look, and you can't see deeply if you don't practice. So I think all those words that you that are mentioned there are ideal. And I always think of that word practice as meaning both practice as in, a ritual, like a meditation practice or that sort of thing, but also just practicing, trying to get better. They're kind of the same thing, two sides of the same coin, or maybe just two edges of the same coin. But I think that's so important. And I want to say before I start, the technical things you can learn easily depending on who is teaching them to you, or you can teach yourself with some diligence and visits to the library and the photo store. So I started as a self-taught photographer, and I started because my aunt was worked for Zeiss Icon in New York. She lived in Brooklyn, and she gave me a set of slides that Zeiss published on the moon, the moon landing. And because it was, they used the Hasselblad with the Zeiss lenses, and that's, so they had a promotion on that. And it got me interested because it was the first time I'd really thought about film. Like family snapshots were always sort of like little books that you get back when you send them away, or actual just snapshots, and usually black and white. And here are these color slides that you look through, and that's all it took. So this is sort of a lineup of the type of cameras I learned on, starting with not the Brownie I had, but a little Brownie. I started with the family camera. And to show you what I knew then, I didn't know if the camera could shoot color film, because my father only shot black and white film with it. And so I didn't even understand that much. So I got the Brownie and I started getting slide film. I had a Nicromat when I went to college, and a Rolleiflex well after. And finally, the big, after grad school, I think I got a Bush 4x5 Pressman, which is what this is. This was the camera, I think when I was about 13, the same aunt bought me. And I got to say, you know, it probably seems ungrateful. I think I wanted the 1000L or something like that, which actually had adjustable shutter speeds and apertures. This one was sort of, I think, shutter speed priority or aperture priority, which in a way was even harder for me to figure out. But I'm very sentimental about this camera. It was a very unusual camera, made in Germany, obviously, and made very nice pictures. And I'm sorry to say I sold it when I was in college, and I wish I hadn't. These are some early pictures that I made. These are from 1970. So I would have been about, let's see, 13, 14. You know, landscapes, skyscapes. I mean, I could show you worse pictures, but I thought I'd at least somewhat show you some interesting experiments I was trying. I think the two on the left are from a trip my parents and I took to visit my brother at an archaeological dig in Illinois. And I think the lower left one is from the Mississippi River. So that was the first thing I did, and I sent them out and got prints. And then I got a darkroom kit for 1 year as a present, and didn't have an enlarger actually at first. So I could only make little tiny contact prints. But and so then I started learning the darkroom. And I think it's something you could learn by yourself. I think somebody has said, like, you know, you could probably do it faster if somebody teaches you, but eventually you get the idea. I basically learned by going to the library, which I did anyway regularly, and looking up books on photography and darkroom work. And we had a photo store a few miles from my house. So I would go to the photo store, talk to the guy at the counter who knew a little bit, because in those days they actually did at the photo store know things. And so the first roll of film I developed, I remember quite well. I hadn't even bothered to try to put the film on the reel properly. I didn't even understand that that was the goal, that the little grooves were important. I had no idea. So he set me right on that, and that got me developing film successfully. And so it went. So I'll stop there for that with the pictures, and say that after high school, which is what we're looking at here, and after undergraduate, I moved to New York. I did go to SUNY Brockport for my undergraduate education. And I remember my father always used to say, you know, do you need to go to, you know, college to learn photography? You know, in other words, is it just like you know, he was a linotypist. So he had learned I don't want to say a trade. And he saw photography somewhat like that, although he understood it was a little bit more creative, was supportive of that. But I think the answer was no, probably not. I could have continued to learn by myself. Partly, I think I needed to go away and be away from my parents. Also, as a first generation college kid, I really didn't know much about photo programs. I did look at Purchase. We drove up there, Purchase, New York, and which ended up being an amazing program. But this would have been like the first couple of years that it was even open as a campus. So there was a lot of construction. It just seemed too early to go there, unfortunately. But what I learned in college in the 1970s did not serve me that well. I have to say, it was very, very basic, mostly things I already knew, and teachers talking about how to crop a picture to make it more interesting. And they weren't talking about seeing or looking, or I guess they, at least at that time, and maybe I wasn't ready. When I left there and came back home, I looked for a job in New York. And I got a job as an assistant for a commercial photographer, and started going out at night to photograph in clubs because I was interested in what was going on in the music world at that point. So the first things I photographed when I was in New York were typically street scenes, sort of, I'm showing you two kind of, well, the one on the left is not really askew. It's just oddly sitting next to the picture that's very askew. But, I had I hadn't practiced long enough, and I was just making pictures as a young guy makes pictures, and whatever I saw, trying to find a way in. Here's a picture. This is from St. Mark's Place, I think. All I knew at this point really was street photography. At some point I did learn about light gallery, but I don't think I truly understood what was going on in the art world, photo world at this point. I did take some classes while I was in New York, and I'm glad Tony mentioned her, but I did take the class at the New School with Lisette Modell, whose photograph you see on the right. And this sort of coincided with my project photographing people who were hanging out at CBGBs and Max's Kansas City and clubs like that, and what people would call the punk scene and so forth. I was interested in the music, but it was also the first time I found a subject that was challenging, was exciting. The pictures really, I'd really run back at night, or I guess I wouldn't run, but I'd go right back to the studio, which I had access to, and I developed film and make proof sheets and, kind of that thing. And then I took her course, and, she was a kind of a tough cookie type, and, but she was very nice lady. And I admired her work so much, and that of the work of Dia and Arbus. I had to throw this in because this is a picture that Lisette did of, I think it's at a Bowery nightclub. And then I thought, oh my God, Dee Ramone at Max's Kansas City, one of the first pictures I made there. And I thought that was great, although her picture's way, way wilder, I have to say. The empty stage at CBGB's. And I guess what this is in my trajectory, I was just kind of an observer. I like to look, and I made pictures of what I saw. And it goes back to, I don't know that I could have expressed it then, so it goes forward to something I learned when I went to grad school. In 1986, I left New York, and by 1990, I was at Bard College, where I studied with Stephen Shore and Ann Turin and John Devola. And so I learned something about photography that I hadn't really thought of before. And I wanted to read very quickly the introduction to the book you see on the left, which has my name on it, is the new Photographer's Eye workshop and workbook, sorry. And it's basically, it says adapted from the Photographer's Eye by John Tchaikovsky. It's basically like like you would have for a teaching workbook for a textbook in maybe even in a high school or grade school. So he writes in the introduction, and at the end it lists Larry Fink, Charles Hagan, Stephen Shore, and Ann Turin. This is the introduction to the program and to the, so I guess this is the handbook. And he writes, I say he, I'm thinking Shore, but Larry Fink and Ann Turin may have had something to do with it. A photographer's growth is a product of the simultaneous development of three interdependent factors. The first is the conscious or intuitive understanding of the visual language of photography. That is how the world is translated into a photograph, and how a photograph orders the segment of the world in space and time, which it shows. This is a photograph's grammar. The second factor is the acquiring of technique. Without a technical foundation, there is no possibility of expression. The broader the foundation, the greater the scope of expression. This is a photographer's vocabulary. The third factor is the photographer's work on his or herself. This entails the overcoming of visual and psychological preconceptions and conditioning, the deepening and clarifying of perceptions, and the opening to one's emotions and finding of one's passions. This is a photograph's content. It is the photography department's aim to give instruction in this three-part process and to provide a historical and aesthetic framework for the student's development. It's really interesting. So that's coming from a program, a photographer, Stephen Shore, who's completely self-taught, Larry Fink, who is essentially self-taught, and Ann Turn, who's very much, comes from the academy. But it's when you break it down, it's just very simple. You learn the technique, you learn the craft to express yourself. You learn how photography shows the three-dimensional world in 2 dimensions, and then you grow both as somebody, both in your perception and both as a person. And that's what I was trying to get at with the picture of the stage at CBGB's. I think I was looking for that next step, like okay, this is a scene and I'm photographing it, and this is this person and that person, but I was looking for something beyond that. I was looking how to make a picture with much less, I guess. And that's when I went to Bard and studied with these people. That's The Photographer's Eye by John Tchaikovsky, and The Nature of Photographs by Stephen Shore, which really was a much later version and much more thought through and expanded version of these workbooks that he gave us. They're both about the fundamentals of seeing, 2 dimensions versus 3, the frame versus the peripheral vision, as Tchaikovsky says, the discrete parcel of time that photography describes. I always like that because it is like your camera opens and closes and collects light for that amount of time. So I think being conscious of these things really made me think very differently about photography. And as it was, and as it still is, books were very important to my trajectory. And so Uncommon Places by Stephen Shore was a book that right away puzzled me. It was not an easy book. It's so popular. The work is so popular now. When I saw it, I didn't completely understand it. It definitely appealed to me, the work, but I didn't quite understand the simplicity and yet the perfection that he was going for. I mean, with every little square inch of that frame, described how it should be described, not only in Ansel Adams's terms of the full, in this term, the full chromatic experience, but also just the formal experience. And then John Devola was influential and somebody I've still kept in touch with. And although he is, works conceptually in some ways, I think he's at heart a landscape photographer. And at least that's the way I think he sees himself, and I do as well. So he photographs landscapes and interiors, but with his interventions and with other people's interventions. So I was in New York about 10 years. I was in the Hudson Valley about 10 years, and I was beyond Bard. And finally skipping to, so after Bard, I started teaching, my teaching career, and I taught first at a community college, then for 3 years in Southwest Missouri. And then we moved to Maine, and I taught at a bunch of places in Maine as sabbatical replacements, as 3-year contract positions, until I finally was fortunate enough to land at Colby. And when I got there, it was a part-time position at first, and it was purely black and white. There were 2 courses at best. There was mostly photo 1, but sometimes a photo 2. So it's a 1-person department, and for that, I felt like I had to do my best to enrich that. I think, my sense of, I feel like I can teach photo 1, and that's fine. And it's actually my favorite course to teach, but it would be nice if there were, other people talking, voices in their ears, as with, as in bigger programs. So I've brought a lot of speakers to Colby, Emmett Gowen, and Mark Steinmetz and Andrea Modica and Mitch Epstein and Lisa Carezzi and Unmi Lay and a few others. And I feel like that's really important. And I also feel like, I have this sort of, my own canon. And of course I expand it to be more diverse. And I try to, pitch the right books and work to the right students. But Robert Adams, who was never my teacher, but is one of my teachers, right? Was very influential, and his writing and his work is essential. So beauty and photography, we often read in either the first or the second semester of black and white photography. Walker Evans, of course, you see Susan Sontag, Marcel Duchamp. I try to keep up with theory, but I don't teach theory, and I don't teach a theory-based way of working. So the photo book is very important. You can see the series there. I have the first 3 books, and the library has even more, but this is my own bookshelf at school. It's an important part of my teaching, is sharing these books with students, and the ones who are hungry, they just eat them up, and they start learning names, and they start looking online, and they start going to the library and looking at other people's work. I think the best education is looking at photographs, your own, your colleagues, and others in the world. So you got Adams, you got Friedlander, you got Harry Callahan, Atget, Judith Ross, Emmett Gowen, and a million others. I don't want to limit it to that, but these are important ones to me, and there are so many others. But the books make the work accessible, and they're great ways of teaching. And not just that the work's accessible, but the books are so beautifully made now, and they're so tightly conceived and beautifully printed. So it's such an important tool. I'm kind of winding up, I guess, just to let you know if you're worried. Not keeping track of the time, but I was fortunate to meet Bill Tsiaras when I was on the board of governors for 1 year when I was associate chair of the art department. And it was I think it was in New York, where I introduced myself to him, because I always taught with the photographs that often said the Tsiaras Family Collection, including Harry Callahan's. And so I just before lunch, I introduced myself to him, and he said, well, what do where are you sitting? Why don't you sit next to me and we'll chat? And so we did, and it became apparent to both of us that a photograph, he had been the chair of the Board of Governors, and Sharon Corwin, the former director of the museum, bought a print of mine to give to Bill as a parting gift. Something from one of the series I did of trees, and we both figured out that was me and that was him, and he said it was his wife's favorite photograph, and which sounds like a backhanded, it's my wife's favorite photograph, which is not at all what he meant, but it was one she really liked. Little did I know how his tastes ranged, and he had a very good eye for certain types of work. Landscape was important to him, and the new topographics were important to him. And so it made sense, particularly what I was doing. And we talked about it, and he said, well, who are you showing with, or do you have a gallery? And I said, no, it's so difficult. And he said, well, what I could do, I'd love to see your work, and I could buy some of your work. I collect, and I'll keep some, and I'll give some to museums. And I realized then, and I know now, I mean, it turned out he really liked my work, genuinely. He wasn't just doing it, and I took him up on it. I went down there to his home, and he and Nancy are just terrific, warm people, and made me eat a delicious sandwich before I drove back. So kind. And but anyway, he did buy a different groups of my work and donated some to RISD, and I think some to Colby, and some to the Portland Art Museum in Oregon, and maybe a couple others. But and now some more came to Colby with this collection. But it's the new topographics that I really respond to, and when I came to Maine, it was this picture, which is in the collection, or this series of pictures, which is in the Tsiaras collection with some, I think at least another one of this and some other work, was work that I made just after 9/11, just before and after 9/11, as sort of what I was calling landscape diary. And it was my way of finding my way back into my work after moving from Missouri and photographing prairies in color to find something in Maine that got a little closer to where I wanted to go. Again, always learning, constantly growing. Teaching for me has been, such an important part of my growth as an artist. So I don't see it as, I know when I went into the MFA program, I thought I need to teach. It's the best way to make a living. I didn't realize how critical it would be to my own practice. So it's really nice to have this picture because this series was seminal. I like this picture, but, I was so happy when he looked at this work and picked these pictures that I think usually my work is pretty quiet and not everybody will look at it and say, yeah, I want that picture. It's pretty quiet. So it really made me respect him and his collection. And I'm just honored to be in it and be talking about it. And just to say, going back to bringing people in, Barbara Bosworth will be with us next week, giving a lecture on campus at 4:30, and her studio manager is going to give a demonstration the next day about the Dust Collective, these beautiful handmade photography books. But so a little plug, and again, thank you, everybody. That's my story.
Well, thank you all so much. I was thinking about just the tremendous generosity of this evening. And Gary, it was wonderful to hear the story of how your work entered the Tsiaras collection. And I can only imagine how many other stories there are. In fact, I've had the pleasure of hearing some of those stories from Bill. So this is really wonderful. We are a little past time, but I think we're going to give it a little time because if people need to leave, that's fine and completely understandable. And this will be a recording for the future. So I think we should let it have its moment to come to a moment of conversation. So I have loved, Tony, I love the resonance, serendipitous of the great age of clubbing with Gary's CBGB moment. And the 4 o'clock problem, I think we could all ponder that there'd be different maybe times of day. Sunday is sometimes one we all can feel. And then I loved the mention that you had, I think, Roz, of Emmett Gowen, that it was about taught, how to be a photographer, right? Not how to photograph. That's a beautiful thought, and so wonderfully represented in your.
I can remember which student said it, but
yeah,
it is correct.
Yeah. And then I think Gary also something related. I think it was in the John Tchaikovsky reference that photography orders a segment of the world. So on that note, I want to ask a general question, and then there are some other questions that have come in that are more specific. But the general question I would ask is about a book that David Vestal published in 1975 called The Craft of Photography. And I'm curious, since what we're partially talking about here is how photography came to be respected as an art form, right? That's part of this story. I'm curious, just if each of you, maybe we'll start with Roz, if you would describe photography as a craft, is that a helpful understanding for you?
I would probably say it is a craft, particularly because if you can't learn the vocabulary, you can't write the poem. So I think knowing, even just as I pointed out, some of the basics of, that your camera can make depth of field, that your prints have a range of tone. If you don't learn that aspect, you're limiting the means of your communication. So craft, but you've got to get to the personal, or all your photographs look like everybody's crafted photographs.
Well put. Well, did Tony or Gary, do either of you want to chime in on this question?
Well, I'll say, yeah, I agree. There's a craft to it. It's sort of a craft seems like a bad word, like it's a craft rather than an art. But there's a craft to photography. There's a technical aspect to it. And I think you do have to learn that. It is just like it is the language, it's the vocabulary. And yeah, then of course you have to learn to expand on that, to have that kind of under your belt. But, there are people who get really nerded out and they get into, too much craft, and then they lose sight of what they're even beginning to do. So, it's a question for me of like, I feel like the central thing I try to teach them is basic craft, what they need. And then, if there's anything else you need, we'll kind of figure it out. But, learn the basics, and then don't learn craft just to kind of, glitz it up, if you know what I mean.
Not craft for craft's sake, right?
Right, not craft for craft's sake.
Craft for the purpose.
Right.
So there's one of the first questions we received was about Sid Grossman. And there are a few questions, and we could probably talk, and I wish we were all sitting around the dinner table together, but so that some of us can get to dinner, I'm going to just ask one of this, which is really related to sort of the social practice versus art question with the Photo League. So would Sid Grossman have rejected the very idea of photographic work being an artistic/aesthetic vocation? His premise seemed to focus wholly on truth, with an editorial purpose focused on justice and injustice. So, would he have rejected the idea that what he was doing was art? And maybe that's a question for you, Tony.
Okay, sure. Yeah, well, it's an open question. I think art historians debate quite vigorously the nature of the aesthetic in the Photo League, and in fact, the Photo League photographers themselves debated pretty vigorously among themselves about what a proper photograph would look like. I mean, there's a famous story of a photographer who brings a photograph into the group sessions, the critique sessions, and it had so many shadows in it that it looked like a two-dimensional design, which caused an uproar among the more socially minded photographers in the group there. But I would say that for Grossman himself, there was always a kind of balance between an aesthetic sensibility. And after all, I think he would have adhered to what both Roz and Gary are saying about learning the craft of photography. And for him, that also took into consideration something of its aesthetic dimensions. But none of that would have mattered. None of that would have mattered at all if it didn't have any kind of social justice imperative to it. And there's an argument, to briefly conclude here, there's an argument that when the Photo League was in trouble in the 1940s, and particularly because of its political affiliations, that Grossman himself began to articulate in a much more ebullient and aggressive way what had always been implicit in his ideas. There wasn't, in fact, an aesthetic aspect to the way he taught camera work. And in fact, he let his own later photographs kind of display that in a much more visible way.
Great. So Roz, there's a question for you that we'll end the evening with, but Gary and Tony may want to also add in their comments. We'll see. But the question is, did you have a singular inspiration to go down the path of photography?
I probably grew up with an affinity for working with people, talking with people. My father had a store on Main Street, small town America. And I think listening to people talk about their problems to my parents in the store and things like that just meant that I was interested in people. And so when I got to RISD, I hadn't intended to be a graphic design major or a photography major. I think just being around Callahan, and seeing that you could speak personally about yourself, what you loved, what was important to you. And actually, when I taught the kids, directing them to photograph what inspired them or what they enjoyed. It's what I did. And I think I can understand both the Photo League imperative, and also today there are a lot of photographers who really do feel that it's important for the photographer to be participating in social change. And I think reportage, documentary, I used to think I was a documentary photographer, and it wasn't until I looked at a body of my work and I said, oh, these are all about me. So I think a good photograph is both. You may see what's outside yourself, but you're talking about your world and how you experience it. And that's what makes a photograph moving.
Well, that is beautifully put, and I feel like I could continue listening and asking you questions all evening long, but I also want to let you go off to your evenings. And I just want to thank you all so much for your generous contributions this evening to this conversation, and also to thank Bill and Nancy Tsiaras for this beautiful collection that has inspired this conversation. Let's see. So special thanks as well to Chris Bergquist, our curator of education, and to Alex Falk, our tech aficionado behind the curtain. And finally, I want to note that the next art and program will delve into politics and portraits of 16th and 17th centuries in Central Asia with Dr. Marika Sardar. And that event is on March 30th at 6 p.m. Actually, I believe it's 5 p.m., sorry, available in person and live stream. So both for this particular special evening. More information can be found on our website. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. The Colby Museum is free and open to all. An active site, the Tsiaras Family Photography Collection, will be on view through August 14th. We hope you will have the opportunity to visit us soon. Thanks again.
Thank you, Beth.
Thanks, Beth. Thanks, Tony. Thanks, Roz.
Thank you all. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, really enjoyed it.